attend today.
Yep, so we'll get started in 1 more minute. All right, it is 1:30, so I do want to get started because we have a lot to go through today. And thank you for joining us. My name is Rebecca Allen. I'm with the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services. We're here just kind of facilitating this webinar opportunity with the great presenters that we have today. So I'm just going to do a brief introduction for our 3 presenters. Leslye Orloff, which she's with the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project at American University. Rosanna Bellestreri with Reach, and Rebecca Grafton with Ayuda. And like Leslye said a moment ago, we are recording this, and the recording and the PowerPoint slides, as well as the resources discussed during the webinar today, will be shared with all participants. And then someone did enable closed captioning. If you do need to do that, you can do that at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please use the chat for any questions. We are happy to answer them as they come up. And I think that is about it. And so I'll turn it over to our presenters.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Leslye Orloff. I direct the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project at American University, Washington College of Law. We are very happy to have you join us today for our webinar on improving language access for immigrant crime victims in Maryland. Next slide, please. This webinar has been sponsored in part. Not only is it hosted by the Governor's Office in Maryland, but it's been sponsored, at least my participation here has been sponsored by the Office on Violence Against Women. And what you'll hear the speakers talking about today will be their views and don't necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice. Next slide, please. And I just want to say I'm very particularly happy to be here today because language access is a big part of what we do, and language access advocacy, which I'm going to be talking about, is also a big part of the advocacy that our clients depend on. And so really, I think today we'll have a good opportunity to expand everybody's skills on how to work with interpreters, on when interpreters are needed, and what kind of advocacy you can do to make sure that not only your agency provides the interpretive services that you should be for your clients, but also that you're better able to advocate with other agencies for that same access for other places your client needs. Rebecca, you opening words?
Sorry, from me, Rebecca?
Yeah, you, Rebecca.
Thank you. We've got multiple Rebeccas on here. So, yeah, my name is Rebecca Grafton. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Training and Technical Assistance Specialist on the Language Access Program at Ayuda. I'm really happy to be here today. I'm going to be talking about language access, the services that our program provides. We do a lot of work in Maryland, probably with some of you already. So yeah, I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
And Rosanna?
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. My name is Rosanna Bellestreri, and I'm the founder of Reach Reaching Diversity, where I do health equity and cultural and linguistic consulting. And today I'll be talking to you a little bit later today about how to work effectively with interpreters and hopefully provide you enough guidance so that you don't feel lost in times of need.
Wonderful. Next slide, please. So now that you know who we are, we want to get a sense of who you are. So we're going to start with our first poll. And the question is, can you please tell us which of the following fits your profession? Are you a victim advocate working with a state coalition? Are you a family lawyer? Are you a prosecutor or law enforcement? Or are you a victim advocate that works in a prosecutor and law enforcement office? Or if you're something else, if you're, something other than that, could you type it in the chat and share with us what your background is?
Are you seeing the options, Leslye?
Okay, and we're just waiting for, let me see how many people we have.
Well, I'm sharing them, but it looks like we have 60% victim advocates and coalition staff, prosecutors, law enforcement, and their victim witness staff is about 27%, and then others. So I think people are chatting with that. No one chose family law attorneys.
Okay. Okay, and if you're other, so I see an immigration attorney. Good. So let me tell you a little bit about, as we get started, next slide, please. A little bit about the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project. We're based in DC, do a lot of work in Maryland and all over the country. And just so you know, we can be a resource to you on these issues. We provide training and technical assistance to state, federal, and local law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, victim advocates, attorneys, and other professionals who work with immigrant survivors of domestic violence, child abuse, dating violence, sexual assault, elder abuse, and other crimes in their work. And our goal is to increase your capacity to serve more victims by supporting you so that you don't have to do the legal research or on the various topics that we can offer assistance with. And we specialized in immigration law, family law, public benefits law, language access, and a whole range of services available to immigrant survivors. Next slide, please. We also offer 4 communities of practice that we would like to invite you to join. One is family lawyers. That's been meeting for about 7 years now, I think, maybe even longer. Monthly, roughly, family lawyers across the country that do work with immigrant survivors. We've, in the last 2 years, started a new victim advocate community of practice. It's been going for a little over 2 years now, where victim advocates, again, can set the agenda of what they want to learn and learn from each other and teach each other about best practices. If you work in law enforcement or prosecutor's office, or you're a victim advocate in either of those types of agencies, we have a roundtable that's only for law enforcement and prosecution agency staff. And for those of you that may be working with judges in Maryland who you think might be interested in a judge's peer-to-peer opportunity, we also offer that. Next slide, please. So our learning objectives for today, by the end of the workshop, you'll be able to better understand Maryland's language access services offered by Ayuda. You'll be able to enhance language access within your organization and advocate for clients gaining access, language access to other agency services, both governmental and non-governmental. You'll be able to identify pivotal points where lack of language access can negatively impact an immigrant victims or their children, and you'll better be able to collaborate with interpreters. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with some demographics. Next slide, please. So if you could type in the chat, tell me what countries do victims come from in your jurisdiction? Where are you seeing victims come from in Maryland? So you should enter the answer in the chat. And I'm not seeing anybody yet. Anyone want to take a stab? Oh, wait, I'm only seeing everyone. Okay, so I'm seeing Honduras, El Salvador, and Mexico. Anybody else? Guatemala, Mexico. Other countries? Rebecca, where else are you seeing people from when you're in your work in Maryland at Ayuda? Rebecca Grafton. Holland?
Yeah, we see clients from Ethiopia, clients from, yeah, that's a big one. Clients from Vietnam, China,
Afghanistan is in the chat.
Afghanistan, yeah, especially last
Haiti,
year.
Central African Republic, Nigeria, all countries in API. Okay, now we're mixing it up a bit. Exactly. This is great. Okay, next slide, please. So in Maryland, you're a state with almost 16% of your population being people from that are people from born abroad. 55% are naturalized citizens, 27% are lawful permanent residents, and 17.5% are either some kind of a temporary visa or undocumented. 31% of children under the age of 18 in Maryland have one or more immigrant parents. And 85% of children living in mixed immigration status families are citizens. So you have significant numbers of children living either who themselves are immigrants or living in homes with an immigrant parent. Next slide, please. And as we see from your responses, there is a good mix. I mean, this is like one of the most balanced mixes I see in many states. We do this a lot. And so 38% of your immigrant population is from Latin America. Almost 30% is from Asia. 20% is from Africa. That is a significantly high number. And I want to apologize that I understand Western and Eastern Africa are not countries, but that's the way the data is reported on the census. Getting down to the country level is really hard to do. But the other thing that's important, and I noticed somebody said Holland, 9% of the foreign-born people in Maryland are European. So you're definitely seeing a broad mix. Next slide, please. And when you look at languages spoken at home in Maryland, Spanish, Chinese, Yoruba, Twi, Igbo, French, Amharic, Korean are the highest ranking, the most common. Tagalog is another one, Urdu. I mean, you have more than 25,000 people in the state speaking each of those languages and Russian. I mean, all of those different languages. But what's really interesting, if you look at the next slide, is that when you, oops, I guess there's only that one. I'm missing. Okay, we're good. Yeah, so that's where I wanted to be, languages spoken at home. That's fine. What's interesting too is there's, and I'll provide the slide in the slide deck that we put online. There's another slide where you can see limited English proficiency, and that list doesn't look exactly the same as this one. So that you might have often, like, for example, you'll have more limited English proficiency in many states in the Vietnamese population than you do in the Spanish population per capita. So it's important. Next slide, please. And I'm going to now turn it over to Rebecca.
Thank you so much. Again, so happy to be here. My name is Rebecca. I'm from the Language Access Program at Ayuda. So Ayuda is an immigrant services organization that provides holistic legal, social, and language services to immigrant communities in the DC metro area. So the Language Access Program in particular provides language services as well as training and technical assistance for free to nonprofit victim service and legal service providers in DC, Maryland, and Fairfax, Virginia. So I'm going to talk today about providing language access for limited English proficient and deaf and hard of hearing victims of crime, and the services that Ayuda's Language Access Program provides that you may be able to draw on to serve your clients. Some of you may already work with organizations that already use our services. If you don't, I urge you to contact us to find out if we could partner with your organization to be able to provide language services for you. And if your organization does work with us, I hope this provides some helpful context and information to improve your experience using language services and help provide more effective access for your clients. I want to make sure that you note our email here, which is interpreterbank@ayuda.com. This is the best way to contact our program if you have any questions about our services, about language access in general. Please send us an email here, and our whole team monitors that inbox, so we'll be able to get you to the right person. Next slide, please. So we're going to start off with some terminology. So this is really important terminology when we're talking about language access. So starting off with interpretation and translation, you may have heard these terms used interchangeably before, but it's really important to distinguish between them because they're two different processes that involve very different skills. And not all interpreters are translators and not all translators are interpreters. Some are trained to do both, but many, only specialize in those skills. So interpretation is oral or signed. It's the rendering of an oral or signed message from one spoken or sign language into another. And it can be done in different modes. The first mode is the consecutive mode, which is where a speaker pauses sentence by sentence or thought by thought for the interpreter to then interpret consecutively. This is often used for one-on-one meetings or small group meetings that might be just 2 to 3 people. So, meetings, regular client meetings, these are the kinds of things that usually consecutive interpretation is used for. The other main mode is simultaneous interpretation, which is when an interpreter interprets at the same time that the speaker is speaking with just a little bit of lag. So if you think about like big UN General Assemblies, when they have interpreters in the box with their headset and they're listening and then interpreting at the same time, that's simultaneous interpretation. So this is usually used for large group settings, large group meetings, or presentations. Translation, the other kind of method of language services is written. Or it's a fixed text. So it's the rendering of a written text from one language into another. And it can also be done into sign language as well. So you can create a sign language translation by creating like a fixed, video text that is a translation of another text. And then we do have a process called sight translation, which it's called translation, but it is performed by interpreters because this is something that interpreters do within an interpreting session when they provide an on-the-spot oral interpretation of a written text. So if you're in a meeting and you're going over a form with your client and you need the interpreter to read that form out loud into the client's language, that would be sight translation. This is something that many interpreters are comfortable with, but not all. So it's always important to ask your interpreter before you ask them to do this, and make sure they're prepared to do so. Usually, sight translation should not be done for more than like 1 to 2 pages of text. Anything beyond that is too burdensome to ask an interpreter to do on the spot. And it's always important to make sure an interpreter has access to the document ahead of time so that they can prepare to provide an accurate sight translation. Next slide, please. So some additional terminology. You've already heard the term limited English proficient. This refers to individuals who do not communicate in English as their primary language and have limited ability to read, speak, write, or understand English. We also have the 2 terms for deaf. Our program works a lot with deaf clients and providing sign language. And so you may or may not have seen these distinctions before, but we do distinguish between what we call big D deaf or capitalized deaf and little d deaf. So big D deaf refers to individuals who identify with the cultural components of deafness, so of a shared language, which in the US is usually American Sign Language, as well as a common life experience, history, and values. Whereas someone who identifies with the term little d deaf doesn't necessarily identify with the cultural aspects of a deaf identity and may have more of a disability association. So little d deaf refers more to like the audiological reality of not hearing, and people who identify with this term might identify more with the hearing community and may or may not use sign language, as opposed to big D deaf referring to more of that cultural identity. I just want to note that all of the terms on these slide, we use these labels, but they encompass individuals with very diverse experiences. Deaf individuals all have very diverse experiences. Of course, limited English proficient refers to, whole groups of people who have all sorts of different language backgrounds, and very diverse language backgrounds. So it could refer to someone who is multilingual, speaks 3 or 4 languages and just not English. Could be highly educated in their preferred language or languages, while someone else could not be literate, or someone could be educated in one language, but feel more comfortable speaking in a native language that maybe doesn't have a written form. So I just want to point out that these terms encompass a lot of diverse experiences. And we can also, we could problematize the term limited English proficient, looking at it, seeing kind of that this term implies sort of a deficit mindset or an English dominance approach, because we're defining someone by what they're lacking, the lack being English. But this is the most prevalent term in the language access space, and especially in, like when we're talking about legal obligations for language access. So, we'll be using that term. Next slide, please. So we've talked about all these terms in relation to language access. What is language access itself? Language access is ensuring that persons who have limited or no English proficiency or are deaf or hard of hearing are able to access information, programs, and services at a level equal to English proficient hearing individuals. Next slide, please. So why do we provide language access? I believe Leslye is going to talk a little bit more about specific obligations in the courts and law enforcement. So I'm going to offer a little bit broader perspective that applies more for nonprofit service providers, since that's the group that we primarily work with at Ayuda. So I want to start off by saying, I hope that we can all agree that LEP and deaf and hard of hearing victims and survivors deserve to get the same support, care, and services that English proficient victims and survivors do. When it comes to institutional provision of legal and social services, there are institutional legal and ethical obligations to provide language access. So on the legal side, for example, we have the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504, which protects individuals with disabilities and requires federally funded programs to provide qualified sign language interpreters, as well as the Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which requires that private businesses offering public accommodations cannot deny services based on disability, including deafness. So since the government classifies deafness as a disability, these services have to be made accessible. This means providing language access, such as interpreters. When it comes to people who use spoken languages, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act makes discrimination on the basis of national origin unlawful, and language falls under national origin. Executive Order 13166 in 2000 provided guidance on enforcement of this title of the Civil Rights Act in regards to providing access to limited English proficient individuals. So for programs receiving federal funding, it is unlawful to discriminate based on language. Locally in Maryland, the Equal Access to Public Services Act of 2002 requires state agencies to take reasonable steps to provide equal access to public services for limited English proficient individuals. So whether your organization is subject to any of these specific laws based on your funding, I'll leave that to your legal counsel to decide, but I want to highlight that it is affirmed at both the federal and the state level in Maryland that language access is a legal civil right, and the denial of it is discrimination. Moving to the ethical side, so the Code of Ethics and Conduct of those professions involved in serving victims and survivors also requires a commitment to language access. So the sections on informed consent in the Code of Ethics of the National Association of Social Workers, the ethical principles of psychologists and Code of Conduct of the American Psychological Association, and the Code of Ethics of the American Counseling Association all require that clients be given information that they can understand in order to provide informed consent. And obviously, you can't provide informed consent if the information is not provided to you in a language you understand. For my attorneys here, a number of the American Bar Association model rules touch on language access. Most obviously the section 1.4 on communications, which requires a client to be kept informed of their case and then have informed consent obtained. And again, obviously, in order to be informed and to provide informed consent, you have to understand the language of the information you're being provided. So I also want to step briefly again out of the institutional requirements and just look at this ultimately as an ethical human issue, because we can't meaningfully or effectively serve LEP or deaf victims and survivors of crime if we can't communicate with them. And not only is it a question of effectively providing services, But if we don't ensure that clients can understand or give them access to an agency in the process, there's a real potential for re-traumatization for victims and survivors seeking help. So ultimately, when it comes to these vital services that we're talking about, we shouldn't be looking at language access services as an auxiliary to be able to receive these services, but rather as an integral component of services for victims themselves. So as we'll talk about, it's important to work with trained professional interpreters, especially interpreters who have training in being trauma informed and working in these settings. And so this, I just want to point out that this kind of moves us beyond the concept of language access towards a concept that's called language justice, which really is an ideal that we kind of try and work towards, where social structures aren't based on the dominance of one language over another, and all speakers can engage and communicate equally. And we could do a whole other talk on this topic itself, but I just want to bring it up because even though we're limited by the resources that we have and the structures we exist within, it's great to hold that as an ideal. Next slide, please. There's my little language justice banner. Thank you. So we're committed to the idea that we need to build language access into our services. How do we know when interpretation is needed? Certainly, if you're working with a client who cannot speak or understand English, you're going to need to work with an interpreter. But there are a number of other situations and different situations where having an interpreter is necessary for equal access. So if you have a client who can understand English but can't communicate, you're going to need an interpreter. If you have a client who can speak English but isn't fluent, you're most likely going to need an interpreter. Also, if your client asks for an interpreter, you want to provide an interpreter. Even if it seems to you that your client, can speak English pretty well and you can communicate, it could be that they prefer to use another language that they feel more comfortable in. And especially when we're talking about working with survivors of crime, who are going to be recounting traumatizing experiences, they may feel more comfortable and more able to express themselves in another language. So it's important to make sure that clients know about the language services that are available to them for free and that aren't required to provide, and respect requests for interpreters whenever possible. Also, from the provider side, even if the service provider, the advocate, the attorney speaks the client's language, if you're less than fluent, you should still use an interpreter, because even if you're bilingual in that language, you may not have the specific terminology needed for the setting that you're working in. So especially if we're talking about the legal area, or highly sensitive issues that victims face, you can benefit from having a trained interpreter. And one way to kind of be consistent about this policy and kind of know how to navigate this is to have a language proficiency testing policy at an organization. So you could create a policy where only staff who have taken, say, the actual oral proficiency interview and have scored above advanced mid can provide services in language, and otherwise staff should use an interpreter even if they speak that language. Next slide, please. So as I've mentioned, it's important to work with professional trained interpreters. This is really, really important to actually provide meaningful access. So I want to talk quickly about situations where some non-interpreter bilingual individuals get called on to provide quote unquote interpretation kind of in an ad hoc way. And this happens when language access measures are not in place, language access hasn't been planned for, and these really shouldn't be happening. So first of all, it often happens that bilingual family or friends are expected to just be able to interpret for clients, but this should really be avoided as much as possible. First of all, just because someone is bilingual doesn't mean that they have the skills to interpret. Interpreting is really hard and involves really specialized skills, so that you don't just have just from speaking another language. So if they're not trained as an interpreter, they're more likely to make errors, to impede the efficacy and accuracy of the services provided, and not have a proper understanding of confidentiality or, in legal settings, attorney-client privilege. So that could be really harmful for the client and their case. Even if, a family member or friend happens to be trained as an interpreter, you should still avoid having them interpret for the client, because, just like you wouldn't have a doctor treat a member of their own family, they may not be able to remain impartial. Also, you don't necessarily know, they could even end up being an adverse party to the client, such as an abuser or a controlling parent or spouse or a community leader with a vested interest in protecting someone besides the client. So we want to avoid that. Secondly, it's sadly still really common to hear stories of children being called upon to interpret for their parents. And not only are children not trained to interpret, but they don't yet have the mental capacity or maturity to necessarily even understand the conversations that they're expected to interpret. Especially if we're talking about victim services and crisis settings. But setting aside that question of accuracy, it's also just plain unethical to ask children to be involved in these upsetting adult conversations and situations. Again, especially when we're talking about the trauma involved in serving victims and survivors of crime. So children should never be used to interpret. Next slide, please. So it's essential to provide language services using trained professionals, and this requires systemic investment in these resources. It's important for all agencies and organizations to build language access into their budgets and planning, but we know nonprofits have, resource limitations. That's a reality. So our program at Ayuda, the Language Access Program, exists to help fill some of that gap and take some of the load of providing language access off of individual nonprofits so that you can focus on providing your services, and to create sort of like a centralized shared resource in order to help provide better language access. So our program operates 2 interpreter banks that work in DC, Maryland, and Fairfax, Virginia. And today I'm going to focus on talking about our services in Maryland, since that's where you all are based. So we receive funding from the Maryland Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth, and Victim Services to run our Victim Services Interpreter Bank. So this interpreter bank provides free services to non-legal victim service nonprofits. And we provide 3 different kinds of services, as you can see here. We work with 108 local specially trained trauma-informed interpreters that interpret in about 17 different languages. We also provide on-demand telephonic and video remote interpretation through a third-party vendor called Leslye, and we provide document translations in almost any language. Next slide, please. So eligibility, as we are a grant-funded program, we are subject to some eligibility restrictions, but the eligibility requirements for clients to access these services are that they're a victim of crime and that they're either a Maryland resident or experience the crime in Maryland. So if your client's a Maryland resident, but they experienced a crime outside of Maryland, or maybe they, experienced a crime in their country of origin, they're a victim of trafficking or assault, something, anything like that. If they're a Maryland resident, they'll be eligible for our services. Likewise, if your client, say, lives in DC or in Virginia, but experienced a crime in Maryland, then they would also be eligible. Next slide, please. So since we also have, I think, a few lawyers on the webinar today, or who might be watching in the future, I want to talk about as well Ayuda's other interpreter bank, which is the Community Legal Interpreter Bank. So this is especially for legal service nonprofits. Unfortunately, in Maryland, our services are a little more limited. So we only provide 2 of those services that I mentioned, are our local specially trained interpreters. We have 105 who are trained in legal interpretation, especially outside the courtroom. They also work in about 17 languages. And we also provide document translations in about almost any language. Let me make sure I got everything. Oh, yeah. So I just wanted to mention again, unfortunately, we don't provide the on-demand telephonic language line for this bank in Maryland. But since we're talking about clients who are victims of crime today, those clients are eligible through our Victim Services Interpreter Bank. So even if you are a legal service provider, we can always, there's ways we can figure out, how to make sure your clients get served. I also wanted to mention that many of our interpreters are cross-trained and work in both banks. So, if you are working in a legal setting, but you want an interpreter who also is trauma informed and has victim services training, you can request that, and vice versa. It may not be possible for languages where, we have fewer interpreters in, but languages like Spanish, we have a huge pool of interpreters, and a lot of them have, a lot of training in both these areas. So it can be very possible to get you an interpreter, with both of those experiences. Also, even for languages that we don't have interpreters in, we also work with third-party interpreter agencies when our funding allows, to be able to get interpreters in other languages that, our interpreters may not work in. The thing to note about that is that, since they're from another agency, we don't have oversight over them, and so they may not have the same specialized training that our Ayuda interpreters do. Next slide, please. So just to talk really quickly about eligibility for the Community Legal Interpreter Bank, clients who are Maryland residents and legal clients are eligible. I will note that we tend to primarily work with clients who are in Montgomery County and Prince George's counties, just because we have specific funding in those areas that allows us to do more work. We can provide services throughout Maryland, but it's a lot more limited when it comes to legal bank. So sometimes it does become a case-by-case basis. So that's just something to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So just to give you a kind of an overview, from January 1st to November 30th in 2023, the first 11 months of this year, the Victim Services Interpreter Bank in Maryland provided local specially trained interpreters on 455 occasions. The top languages were Spanish, Mandarin, Ethiopian Sign Language, and French. We have an interpreter who works in Ethiopian Sign Language, and she's done a lot of work for us. It's awesome. We're really glad we've been able to help in those cases. We also provided on-demand telephonic interpretation in 1,105 instances and 91 documents translated. Next slide, please. So just to go a little bit more into kind of the details of the services we offer, we have, as I mentioned, we have those two options for interpretation, and I want to distinguish between them a little bit. So on the one hand, we provide local specially trained Ayuda interpreters, who are interpreters who work with us as independent contractors. If you're requesting services from us, you would request those in advance through our online platform, which is Salesforce, and schedule a meeting in advance. These interpreters work on site, remote by phone, or remote by video, so across different modes. I do want to note that if our organization is based in DC, so the further out we get from DC, the harder it can be in terms of arranging on-site interpretation. So for example, if your organization is out like on the Eastern Shore, we may only be able to get you a remote interpreter, but we always encourage you to email us with whatever your needs are, whatever questions you have. Because we'll work with you to see what we can do and point you in the right direction if you need something that we can't provide. And these interpreters are specially trained in interpreting for victim services or legal services in the case of the legal bank. And then the other interpretation option we offer is on-demand telephonic interpretation through Language Line. So this is accessed by calling the Language Line phone number. This is a third-party agency, so these aren't Ayuda interpreters. And again, we don't have oversight over them, and they may not have the same kind of specialized training. But this option, which is remote by phone, or there's a video option for sign language, it's good for like short logistical calls. If you need to confirm an appointment, ask your clients to, bring certain documents, as well as like immediate needs. If you have someone who calls your office or, walks in and you need an interpreter right away, or situations when no Ayuda interpreter is available, but you still need to go forward with the meeting. Next slide, please. And so then we also provide document translations. We don't contract directly with translators. We work with two translation vendors. They're Multicultural Community Service and Schreiber Translations. So they handle the recruiting of the translators and the vetting and the quality control for the translation. And they work in pretty much any language we've ever needed, and they can translate for us a variety of different documents. So client-specific documents, vital documents for your organization, like intake forms or other forms you use routinely, outreach material, if you have flyers about a clinic or an event or information you need for your website, as well as handouts used during group sessions. So PowerPoints for Know Your Rights presentations, or handouts for a support group or something like that. We translate all these different types of documents. I will note that when we do run up against funding limitations, because that happens, we do prioritize client-specific documents and getting those translated, because we want to make sure clients have the documents they need for their case or their services. So we prioritize that over like the outreach sort of documents. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to finish out by talking a little bit about the credentials Ayuda looks for when recruiting interpreters, and the trainings that we look for and provide. So interpreters who work with Ayuda's Interpreter Bank have to have completed the following requirements. So first, they have to at least have completed a 40-hour foundational interpreter training. So this is an interpreter training in the fundamentals of interpreter ethics and skills. It could be a training like the community interpreter or bridging the gap training, which prepares medical interpreters. And then on top of that, they need to have completed specialized training in the relevant content area. So this would be either victim services interpreting or legal interpreting. They also need to demonstrate proof of proficiency in their working language or languages. So this is often a qualifying score on a language proficiency test, but it also could be something like certification as a court interpreter, because that process requires language proficiency testing as well, or having a degree in the language or in interpreting itself.
Rebecca,
Yeah.
there was a question in the chat about
Sure.
somebody was asking about the name of the proficiency test you use or recommend.
Yes.
If there's one in particular.
Sure. So there are a variety of different tests and a couple different scales that are used. One that's really common, the one that I mentioned, is the ACTFL oral proficiency interview. The abbreviation is ACTFL, and I cannot remember honestly what the acronym stands for, but it's a really widely known test. And I think LTI, Language Testing International, is the company that provides that test.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that to my attention, Leslye. Appreciate it. Yeah, so language testing. Yes, thank you, Suzanne. Thank you for putting that in there. So language testing, that's important. Want to make sure we've confirmed proficiency. And then finally, all our interpreters need to complete a background check to check for any criminal convictions, since we are working, especially since we're working with victims of crime. Next slide, please. All right, so now I'm just going to talk about the two specialized trainings that Ayuda looks for and actually provides for interpreters in the two content areas we work. Interpreters don't necessarily have to have taken these specific trainings to work with us, but they have to have equivalent training. And we look at, the content of the training an interpreters had, and we measure it against these specific trainings, because these were specifically developed for Ayuda actually by Cross-Cultural Communication, which is an interpreter training company. So we actually periodically offer these trainings for free to interpreters in the community in order to, build up interpreter competencies generally, and also, increase the pool of interpreters who are available to work with our networks. So the first training is the Breaking Silence training. This is in trauma-informed interpreting for victim services. It's a 4 to 6 day training, depending kind of on the format it's being offered in, whether it's all in person live, whether there's online components, etc. We've done it in a variety of different ways. And it covers working with crime victims, providing victim-centered and trauma-informed interpretation, how to deal with vicarious trauma, which is a really important topic for interpreters in this space, especially, and victim services vocabulary and how to maintain and build that vocabulary. It involves a lot of role playing and completing exercises that ahead of time, before an interpreter gets into an interpreting situation. This practice can help prepare an interpreter for the sensitive nature of these victim services situations. The last time we offered this training was this past spring in 2023, and it was actually taught by my illustrious co-presenter here, Rossana Balistrieri, who has done this training with us for us a number of times, and we're always really happy to work with her. Next slide, please. And then the other training that Ayuda provides is called the Language of Justice. This is normally a 3-day training, but again, can kind of vary depending on the format that we conducted in. But it focuses on legal interpretation, specifically outside of the courtroom, since we do work with a lot of court interpreters, but court interpreting has its own rules and regulations. And so we focus on really getting interpreters those skills to work in the out-of-court settings when you're having a meeting with an attorney and a client, and the specific considerations involved there. So this training covers legal terminology and legal topics, the US legal system, attorney-client privilege, what that is, how that, what that involves for interpreters, confidentiality, how to protect that, and the unauthorized practice of law and avoiding that. And so this training also involves role-playing and practice exercises based on actual attorney-client meetings. And we actually just recently held a version of this training last month for American Sign Language interpreters. It was taught actually in ASL. So that was really a really exciting event this fall. So that's it for me. I'm going to pass it, I think, back to Leslye. I'll try and look through the chat because I know there were some questions that I'm not a good multitasker, so I'll go to those now and see if I can answer anything. But yeah, thanks so much, and I'll pass it off.
I'm muted. Thank you, Rebecca. Okay, so next slide, please. I'm gonna start in this next session. I'm gonna very briefly give you a little more information about the federal law requirements and focus on law enforcement courts in particular, based on some of the training we're doing. Language access law, as you heard from Rebecca, is rests in Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and that the goal is that no person should be treated on the ground of natural origin, which was where language access is rooted, be excluded from participation or denied access to benefits, be subject to discrimination on any program receiving federal financial assistance. Next slide, please. And then there's an executive order that describes the goals, which is to provide meaningful language access, instructions and guidance about what Title VI and Lau v. Nichols requirements are of federal agency and grantees, and encourages something that Rosanna is going to be talking a lot more about, which is development of language access plans. Next slide, please. And that, meaningful access means that they should be, that language assistance that results in accurate, timely, and effective communication at no cost to the LEP individual. For LEP individuals to be able to meaningful access denotes access that is not significantly restricted, delayed, or inferior as compared to the programs or activities provided to limited English proficiency individuals. So that's when we're talking about work with immigrant crime victims, that's what we're all required to do. Next slide, please. And when we talk about who's covered, it's any federally conducted program, state and local government agencies, and non-governmental agency organization grantees. And as you heard from what Rebecca talked about, that's grantees of the state and grantees of the federal government. And what's really important to understand is it doesn't matter what the government is funding. So let's take a police department. Let's say they're funding the body cameras, and it's not likely to happen, but the only thing that that police department gets is funding for body cameras. It doesn't matter what the funding is for. If they get any federal funding, it means these laws apply. So these laws apply to the victim assistants, to the prosecutors, to the police officers, to everybody for everything they do if they get money for body cameras. So it's not about what the money's for, it's about the fact that your agency receives it. Next slide, please. And so recipients of federal financial assistance can include law enforcement, all kinds of government programs, courts, schools, hospitals, and victim services providers. So we're going to do another poll now. Next slide. And so you're a domestic violence program. So a domestic violence victim who speaks Korean comes to your agency for help. What do you do if your organization does not have a staff member who is fluent in Korean? And you're going to mark all that apply here. So the choices are deny the service, do the best you can to try to communicate with them in English, you make a referral to an organization that has Korean interpreters, or you make arrangements to provide Korean interpretation for your client.
All right, I'm gonna close it in just a second. People are still responding. All right. So no one said deny. So that's
Yay!
good.
So 94% of you said to make arrangements for interpreter. That is the correct answer. Do your best to communicate in English. It's probably not the best thing. Rebecca, Rosanna, you want to weigh in on that? Recommendations for the folks that checked that one? Both on mute.
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to be able to provide services if you're just communicating English. If you need to try and communicate with them while you secure an interpreter, do your best. But yeah, that's not going to be sufficient to actually provide services.
Right. Rosanna?
Yeah, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, but absolutely, there are so many avenues for misunderstanding when the language is not shared, and we try to attempt to communicate in English with somebody who is not proficient in English. It's not sometimes just a matter of proficiency. It's a level of comfort, and I'll talk about that when in a little bit.
Great. And as to the referral to another organization as a Korean interpreter, so that's actually the real trick to this question, is that your agency independently, if you receive federal dollars, has an obligation to provide those services to anybody who seeks your services. And the fact that another agency might have somebody who speaks Korean, let's say on staff, that doesn't mean that everybody who speaks Korean in the community gets sent to that agency. So it's really important if you're getting the funding, because there may be things you excel in and that the agency that has a Korean person who speaks on staff, let's say, doesn't excel in. So you can't turn people away because you think another agency may be better for them. And that's key. If you're receiving state or federal funding, you're supposed to be working with interpreters. And this whole training is to help you improve your abilities to do that. Next slide, please. So we're going to do another poll. Does your agency receive any of the following sources of funding? And check all that apply. So the choices are the Maryland Governor's Office on Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services, U.S. Department of Justice, OVW, it might be the COPS funding for law enforcement, VOCA, OVC, HHS, which would be the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act money, or there might be a subgrant through VERA and somebody else from ORR, or other state or government funding. So check all that apply.
All right, it looks like it's slowing down, so I'm going to share.
Okay, so 67% of you received money from Maryland. 50% of you also received DOJ money. We don't have anybody with HHS money, or they don't know they do. And what are some of the other ones in the chat? If you could put them in the chat, that would be great. What other state, because 25% of you said other state or federal funding. OAC.
That's the Maryland Administrative Office of the Courts.
Oh, okay, great. Perfect. Good. So next slide, please, while people are answering. So we can't afford language access isn't an answer. They don't provide an exemption, and if Department of Justice were to investigate, they would look at a variety of factors to figure out, what kinds of previous success you've had using interpreters, whether they're essential services that are being restricted, and these are the factors they're gonna look at when they investigate. Do you have an implementation plan? Do you have a plan to provide language access, or are you just like sticking your head in sand and saying we can't afford it? That's not an appropriate answer. Next slide, please. and I'm going through rather quickly because I want to save as much time as possible for Rosanna as well. So this is the lep.gov webpage that has a lot of really useful materials and resources. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to turn to talking about like what we train law enforcement on, because part of your advocacy is making sure your clients are getting what they need from other agencies. And we'll start with law enforcement. So 2 slides forward, please. The next one, there we go. The Department of Justice has issued model guidance. It's called this, there's a sample center, it's called City Center Police Department. What they did is DOJ took its settlement agreements when law enforcement agencies had been investigated for not providing language access and created a model policy, I guess you could say, which is basically tracks the settlement agreements that they've had with agencies whom they investigated. And so police are supposed to provide free language access to any LEP person who requests it. When the officer isn't fluent in the language and decides that it would be helpful to the criminal investigation or prosecution. So person's trying to speak English, but the officer has questions about whether or not they're actually able to fully communicate in English. So the officer can request an interpreter to make sure that they are getting the right information for the police report, for the criminal case, etc. Police are supposed to inform members of the public that language access is available free of charge, and they're supposed to be providing language access in the person's primary language. Next slide, please. And the next slide has like the sources of law. I'm not going to go over them again. Next slide. This is a summary for law enforcement of what we tell them about how they're supposed to be, why they're supposed to be providing language access. Next slide, please. And I'm just going to kind of say that like this is an exercise we do with law enforcement, and we say, you know, what do first responders do when they arrive on the scene? And if you want to type some things in, you can. I'm going to go to the next slide. Because what they are doing is they're going to secure the scene, look for weapons, find out if somebody's injured, identify the people involved, and figure out if the offender is there or not, separate the parties, do all that kind of stuff. And the next slide, what happens is to do all that, DOJ recognizes that they may have to, they can't call an interpreter necessarily before they've figured out where the guns and stop chasing people. It doesn't work that way. So DOJ has structured their requirements of law enforcement to say that while they're securing the scene, they have to use the most reliable temporary interpreter. And they have to understand when we do our training, we have a DOJ approved training of this, that, you know, a DOJ funded training, not approved, that, I mean, they fund us to do for law enforcement, that they're going to need, they have to understand that they may pick the perpetrator who's doing the interpretation during exigency. They also might pick a child. They may pick the perpetrator's brother, sister, cousin, uncle. And that's why DOJ says, yes, you can use whoever you think the best person is at the moment while you're securing the scene. But don't ask any questions you need for your police report while you're doing that. It's the point at which once everything's secure, then all the language access laws, next slide, kicks in. So they have to go and get the qualified interpreter at the crime scene to write the police report, to ask questions of anybody, to do any interrogations, to interview witnesses, to give Miranda warnings, to give the victims know your rights information. All of that, you need a qualified interpreter. But there is some exigency that will happen before where they shouldn't be collecting any information they're going to need for the police report, but they're trying to secure the scene and keep everybody safe and get people to the hospital and need to get to the hospital. And that's what the rules are as to language access for law enforcement. Now let's turn to language access for courts. Next slide, please. Actually, next slide, please. So the DOJ requirements in terms of courts and language access are that they need to use qualified interpreters, and it's not only in courtrooms, and it's not only in criminal cases. It includes every case. The landlord-tenant case, the domestic violence, the protection order case, the divorce, the custody, the child support case, all of them, not just criminal, not just protection orders. And it's for all types of proceedings. It's not just the trial, it's the status hearing and the motion. And it's for the parent of a child who may be involved in a child welfare or delinquency case, where the child may speak English, but the parent does not. So the parent has an interest in that case, and in being there, they have to be served, let's say. And so they're entitled to an interpreter. And it's anything that any services that the court orders treatment, batters treatment, therapy, drug testing, drug counseling, DNA testing, all of that kind of stuff has to be included as well, and it needs to be incurred with no fees. Next slide, please. And that there are oh, okay, great. So courts in your area, are they routinely providing interpreters in the following kinds of cases? Check all boxes that apply. So are they providing it in criminal case, protection order, protective orders, peace orders, custody and divorce, child welfare? Take a sip while you're voting. Rebecca?
Have about 50% that have submitted so far. So I'm just gonna give it one more second and then I will show the results and end the poll. All right. Here we go.
So it looks like criminal and protection orders are the most, and that you're seeing a lower percentage in peace orders, divorce, custody, and child welfare. So that's really, Rebecca, do you preserve the polls, or can you? Because I think it'd be really interesting to share with the court.
Yes, I think I do. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that would be good. Because it's supposed to be happening equally in all of these. So that's very important to see. Next slide, please. So just so you know that there's also DOJ requires courts to translate petitions, court orders, materials explaining legal rights, signs that are posted in the courthouse, public service announcements. And they're supposed to be using language cards to identify the languages that individuals need. Sorry, I thought I silenced. Next slide, please. And that this is just for you to have, but when you're trying to figure out, when courts figure out, and when you figuring out whether you need to translate a particular kind of document, or whether you might do a site translation like Rebecca was speaking about, let's say of a short brochure, these are the DOJ rules that apply to that. And then I'm going to end my presentation on a little bit about language access advocacy, and then turn it over to Rebecca. To Rosanna. So what's really important is that, on the last part on courts, there was a really interesting report done by the National Center for State Courts in 2006. And one of the things they found is that the courts who've done outreach and are working with agencies, have relationships with agencies that serve immigrant and LEP clients, do the best job of providing interpreters in court. And there's also a bench card you should know about that the National Center for State Courts wrote back in 2006 about how courts can qualify interpreters in like lesser spoken languages that they may if they need to do it and they can't find a qualified interpreter. But it sounds like in Maryland, you should be able to get the interpreters in any language you need. And Rosanna and Rebecca, you can correct me on that if you'd like, but, basically, and then another tip for the courts is that they write the victim's language on the court jacket. So it follows the case throughout, and they have advance notice of what interpreter they need so they can schedule it. Next slide, please. So in terms of language access advocacy, I want to end on just a couple of points. Next slide, please. So from which agencies have your clients run into difficulty gaining language access for their clients? So if I have a client who's going to call law enforcement for help, needs to go to court, maybe they're seeking help from a healthcare provider, transitional housing program, public benefits agencies, and other non-governmental organizations, what are you seeing?
25% have completed it so far, so I'm just going to give it another 10 seconds maybe.
Yeah, and if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat and we will try to work them into the presentation.
All right, I'm going to end the poll and share the results.
Okay. Wow. So this is kind of everywhere. Interesting, Rebecca. This is kind of consistent with what we saw in our survey. Public benefits agencies at the state level, 57% are having difficulty. That's the number, that's the highest. Courts and law enforcement are second. Other government agencies are third. And again, please share in the chat what those government agencies are, because that would be super useful to the governor's office, and for those of us that have been working with the governor's office. I'm on the Family Violence Council for the state, in knowing where those problems are, where we can try to help. And then Rosanna, that's good news. It's the lowest problems are shelters, transitional housing, and healthcare providers. Okay. Two slides, please. Next, there we go. So when you talk about language access advocacy, when we look at where you're having problems, some of the things you want to try to do is plan in advance to give the agency where you're going notice, if you can, that you need an interpreter in a certain language. Educate other programs about their language access responsibilities, build relationships with agencies in your community. And, you know, when I was doing my cases, I was litigating cases back in the 80s and 90s at Ayuda. But in doing that, I basically felt I advocated. Part of my job, I felt as a lawyer, was to let the court know, or let the public benefits agency know in advance, and do what I could so that I wouldn't show up and they'd be scrambling for an interpreter. So they had advance notice, and we could try to head that off so that my client didn't have to take off work when she was going to get there and they weren't going to have an interpreter. So it's really important to kind of see that as part of your advocacy, as part of your case strategy, to make sure you should be advocating like that, just like you advocate for anything else you're trying to do with your client. If a police report was not taken, and we see lots of police reports not taken for LEP clients, which is a whole other issue. That's not supposed to happen at all. And or that it contains misinformation, there's a way to have the report amended. If you encounter those cases, you can call us for technical assistance, and we can help you work with the law enforcement agency to correct the record. And if you run into a barrier, we have law enforcement experts around the country that do technical assistance directly to law enforcement agencies that can help intervene on that problem as well. And then you can also file complaints with the Federal Coordinated Compliance section of DOJ, and we have a sample complaint and the complaint directions in the materials. Now I am going to turn it over to Rosanna.
Thank you, Leslye. And I want to really, if you can please go to the next slide, I want to talk to you about the, again, want to reemphasize the importance of language access, because there is a plethora of research that has been conducted on, including by the National Fire Protection Association, that has concluded that survivors of trauma or victims of crime have difficulty not only expressing themselves, but also focusing on what is being said to them. And they have a really hard time understanding what is being said to them. And it even causes a loss of about 4 grade levels of verbal and reading ability. And I want you to think of the fact that for a limited English proficiency person, or somebody who's deaf or hard of hearing, that language loss and access is significantly greater during particularly a traumatic event. So if you want to, again, add a language barrier during a trauma-informed intervention, where you're building trust, and that trust is really important to fostering resilience. And imagine the possible consequences that of not providing a proper language access plan in place. So a lot of data points to language access as one of the top 3 barriers, so by survivors when accessing public services. And it really should make us all think of the critical element that language access really that access really means for LEP and deaf survivors and victim of crime. Next slide, please. So, you know, what we say really, and how we say it and how it's received, it really can really change the course of our decisions, of our actions, and can make a huge impact on somebody else's life, for good or for bad. And especially in areas where there are serious implications and legal consequences, or even life and death situations are concerned, we need to be very mindful of what we say and how we say it. Next, please. So, and language is really dynamic, is really complex, it's very tricky, especially when we navigate between languages. And at times, we may hear something that we think we recognize and that may lead to assumptions. Earlier in the call, you know, one of the options was, you know, I will try to speak in English, right? And just with the assumption that, you know what, we can get by. A lot of the words look similar, and I think I can understand what the client is saying. But those assumptions can really lead to a lot of misunderstandings because of what is called the false friends. These are words that are etymologically actually related, but in the passage of time of adopting these words, they have assumed different meanings. And so think about, for example, library and librería between Spanish and English, where library is not the same as librería. And librería is not the same as library. Library is, you know, it sounds like a, you know, librería sounds like a library, but librería is an actual bookstore. It's not where you read books. Whereas a library is not where you buy books. In Spanish, it would be a biblioteca, the equivalent. So things can become really confusing. So next slide, please. I want to do a little quick activity, and you can use the chat. You know, can you guess, you know, in the next, you know, 5 to 6 seconds, you know, what these words, these Spanish words may mean in English, just by looking at them. And again, of course, if you are a Spanish speaker, then of course your answer won't count. But for those of you who may not know any Spanish, you know, you look at these words, what comes to your mind? Go ahead and use the chat. Okay, so we get one: molestar, angry, excited to exit, okay, or excited, intoxicated. Okay, so there's a mix of words here. Concussion. So let me go over these very quickly. Excitado means sexually aroused, not excited. Intoxicado is not the same thing as intoxicated. And as a matter of fact, intoxicado, this word, cost a Florida hospital about $80 million in a lawsuit for a patient. And an ad hoc interpreter who misinterpreted this word, and it caused the patient to become a vegetable, in other words. Molestar has nothing to do with molesting. It looks the same, it sounds the same, and it even is etymologically connected, but it means to bug, to annoy. And concussion is not concusión. Concusión is actually a legal term, is another term for extortion. And preservativo is not something that you put on food to lengthen the shelf life, but it's actually a condom. Un preservativo is a condom. So think about these words and how they can really mislead us. And to make it even worse, the next slide, please. There are places and countries where, you know, if we want to complicate things even farther, some countries have dialects. and within the same country, and some people don't even understand between these dialects, and somebody that speaks a dialect doesn't understand another speaker or a different dialect, so that can interfere even farther. And so we need to be paying attention to that, particularly when we're asked, that we're asking what language do you speak, because that language can have a subdialect, and it doesn't mean that that person may get an interpreter that actually shares that same dialect. Next slide, please. And because about 90% of our communication is nonverbal, as a matter of fact, 7% is only verbal, not just 77%. 38% is vocal, meaning our tone, our intonation. And then 55% is visual. And this is according to many, many studies, but one particularly led by Dr. Morabian. We need to be very mindful that something that, we may interpret in a certain way, a gesture that we may interpret, may not necessarily be intended in that way. So many times we look at people and we think that people who evade our stare, that are not looking directly into our eyes, may be evading a question, they may be lying, and it could be something completely different, like showing a sign of respect to somebody who hold a higher status. Next slide, please. I want to show something personal here. Everything that we do is driven by our point of views, our values, or what we know, what we're used to. We're all driven by cultural worldviews. Some of these cultural aspects are visible and they stay in that top part of the iceberg that you see here. Some of them, a lot of them, and most of them are actually invisible. We don't see them. How people think, what they value, their attitudes, what drives their attitudes. And we judge people many times based on what we think fits the mold, right? The cultural mold. I was born and raised in Italy myself. I moved here about 32 years ago. And in Italy, it is customary when you're pulled over for a traffic violation, for example, the driver is customarily gets out of the vehicle and meets the officer to speak to them and engage into conversation. So you can just imagine my reaction when I was pulled over the first time in the US, and I unbuckled myself and I got out of the vehicle, and I started walking towards the officer. Just imagine the reaction of that officer and how taken aback I was, because it didn't make, all of a sudden I was the fish out of water, where what I knew just didn't make any sense. And so we need to be very mindful of this, because again, our behaviors are driven by our beliefs, our values, and things can be misconstrued very, very easily if we don't question what is driving that behavior for that particular person. Next slide, please. All right, so here is a poll for you. Please check anything that applies here. How many of your agencies, or does your agency have a language access plan, or is in the process of developing a language access plan, regularly updates one, or doesn't have a language access plan at all?
So we're still getting some responses, so I'll just give it a couple more seconds.
Yeah.
All right. Looks like it's slowing down.
All right, so 69% looks like you have a language access plan, 19 in the process of developing, regularly updating 6%, and then 13% not a language access plan in place. This is really fascinating. Thank you so much for participating in the poll and sharing with us this data. Next slide, please. So for those of you particularly whose agency may not really have a language access plan in place, or perhaps for those of you who are still developing one, and even for those of you who have one. I hope that the information that I share with you is really valuable. But a language access plan is really key and critical. And it also includes like who is qualified to interpret. And both Rebecca and Leslye talked about this, based on, this is going to drive your policies and procedures. Who do you only use certified? And we do understand that certification doesn't exist for all languages. Certification exams are not being able to right now certify every particular language. And so in the event that somebody who cannot be certified, then they will be qualified. And there are processes also to deem the interpreter qualified within this organization. Are you going to allow ad hoc interpreters to be there? And what are those exceptions? Are those going to be exceptions? Describe what those exceptions will be. Next slide, please. Earlier, Rebecca talked about the ACTFL as one of the examples for vetting language proficiency. And ACTFL, I shared in the chat with you, stands for American Council of on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. However, the ACTFL proficiency testing is geared more towards academia. It's more for academic purposes. The US federal agencies, on the other hand, have for years adopted a different scale, a different language proficiency assessment scale, which is the ILR. ILR stands for Interagency Language Roundtable. And the Interagency Language Roundtable was founded in about 1955. After the military identified the need for a larger coordinated effort to measure language proficiency within U.S. Government and its branches. And so it's very similar in the way that it measures proficiency than similar to ACTFL, where the scale goes from 0 to 5, from no proficiency, 0 being no proficiency at all, to 5 being native-like advanced proficiency. So there are a lot of agencies out there that do language proficiency assessments. So that's for vetting bilingual staff, if you're going to be allowing bilingual staff, and which is ideal if you have bilingual staff that can communicate directly with client. But then there are other different assessments, and those are different than the ones that the ILR scale and the ACTFL really measures, and those are interpreting competencies. Those assessments go beyond just the language proficiency, but the actual interpreting skills. And likewise for translation competencies, which are geared toward those individuals who work with written document translation only. Next slide, please.
Rosanna, I just want to note, we do have 10 minutes left, and I know we have a lot to get through that we might not get to. So right. Just for what we do not get through, just everyone, you will get the slides in the recording. So all right, I will note that. Sorry, I know there's a lot.
All right, so just think about documents, but you've heard this word earlier, vital documents. What are those vital documents? Think about in your organizations, based on the definitions by the U.S. Department of Justice and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, what are vital documents? And do you have all of your vital documents translated in your threshold languages? So think about, threshold language means a language that has been identified as the primary language as indicated by the medical eligibility within zip codes, or the 3,000 beneficiaries or 5% of beneficiary population. But think about, what are some of the documents that are vital and that your agency still hasn't translated. Discuss with your team, about having these available in other languages. Next slide, please. And then, of course, visuals, visual aids for individuals that, who will need to have some way to communicate as you're waiting for an actual interpreter to arrive. Next slide, please. What are your points of contact? This is really important for a language access plan. Who are you going, if there is an incident, who are you going to report that incident to? Who is in charge of supervising the language services? What are the numbers? If you're using third-party vendors for remote interpreting, then who are you going, do you have those numbers handy? Do you know who to contact them? And also in your language access program or plan, is there an agreement in an event of a crisis where multiple agencies may be intervening? Who initiates that interpreter request? Who's responsible for that? And even with that temporary interpreter that Leslye was talking about, who will initiate that temporary interpreter request when perhaps somebody arrives before a law officer? Go ahead and switch to the next slide, please. So next one again. Here are some resources for you to look on, that can guide you on how to put together a language access plan. This has been added to the list of resources, the resource page that has been put together for you. Next, please. Okay, and here are some more resources for OVW funded resources. Next, please. Okay, it's not enough to just have a language access plan in place. You need to implement it. You need to let people know that it exists and what it entails. So what are some of the places where you can really inform your staff? Well, the new employee orientation is a great place to inform a new employee about what the language access plan looks like in your organization, how to go about implementing it, and then periodically checking in with your staff at meetings and doing some in-services to review the language access plan, just to make sure that everyone is on the same page. Next, please. Where interpreting for trauma is involved, you've seen what Ayuda does about providing trauma-informed trained interpreters, which is pretty unique because a lot of interpreters in the United States, unfortunately, are not trained for trauma-informed interpreting. Those who are, they really understand how to navigate through all of these areas where, from adapting their code of ethics from medical to legal to social services and whatnot, and community interpreting. Interpreters are ruled by different codes of ethics, and there are, next slide please, there are a lot of similarities in the code of ethics from the legal and medical field, for example, but there are also some differences. For example, in the medical field, interpreters have a little bit more freedom to do some advocacy or intervene for cultural brokering, whereas in the legal field, it's illegal for interpreters to do any advocacy or any cultural brokering. Next, please. And don't forget, that interpreters, there's a lot going on in the mind of an interpreter, a lot of that is happening at the cognitive skill level when an interpreter is helping you communicate with a client. There's a ton of skills that are working together. So be very mindful also of how conversations may also interfere and affect interpreters. Next slide, please. Always ask about certification or qualifications about your interpreters. There are all courts or all states have an exam, state exams for certifying court interpreters. There's also federal government that certifies court interpreters for federal cases. And for sign language interpreters, the RID, which is the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, will certify ASL interpreters. And in the medical field, we do have two national certification, the Certification of Commission for Healthcare Interpreters and the National Board of Certification for Medical Interpreters. Next slide, please. And I'm going to skip this for a moment, and I want to, because I know that we're pressed for time. If we can skip another 2 slides. all right, just the slide before this one, please. So Rebecca talked about the interpreting modalities, and she did mention about in-person versus telephonic and video remote interpreting. Why is that why is this important? It is important because, again, I want you to always ask yourself, if my client spoke English, would I have this interview or this conversation by phone or video call? And if the answer is no, then you want to ensure that an interpreter is there in person. You shouldn't, just because somebody has a language barrier, they shouldn't have received a service with a different standard. So be very mindful of always giving the same standard of services to everyone, regardless of language barriers. Next slide, please. And we're going to actually go 2 more slides until we hit the slide number 12. Okay, 1 more. Perfect. We'll stay there. So I really hope that this will help you on how to work effectively with an interpreter. Before the assignment, before you actually start having a conversation with your client through the interpreter, it's very, very critical that you brief the interpreter to provide as much information about your client or the session that is going to unfold. This is going to not only prepare your interpreter linguistically and cognitively, but especially emotionally, because interpreters come with also lived experiences, and we don't know if that interpreter shares a lived experience with the victim of crime that they may be interpreting for. So sometimes the interpreter may come forward saying, you know what, this is definitely a conversation that I can't stay impartial about, and I won't be able to interpret for. So that's why it's so important to have those conversations beforehand, so that you're not surprised about those situations in the middle of an intervention. You want to discuss any possible cultural, linguistic, or emotional issues. You may want to agree on a distress signal. If the interpreter becomes really distressed, what signal will they give you to let you know? And always allow the interpreter to find the proper positioning. Proper positioning means that you and your client need to sit in a way that you are going to be directly speaking to each other, as if the interpreter were not there. And always allow the interpreter to introduce themselves to clients as well. Next, please. During the assignment, many times when we are not used to working with interpreters, we will hear things like, can you ask the client? Can you ask? And so the client becomes the third person. And that is not really ideal. You want to speak directly to your client, just as if the interpreter were not there. You want to prioritize eye contact with the client and watch for body language, their facial expression. Also be mindful that the interpreter needs to retain all this information. So we want to speak in short segments, short bits of information. Avoid using very complex language and slang and metaphors and acronyms. Be aware that the interpreter is going to be interpreting in first person and becomes the extension of your voice and the voice of your client. And they will switch to the third person if they need to intervene. For example, if the client said something that they need to clarify, or if they need a repetition. Also be mindful that occasionally the interpreter will switch to a third person as a mechanism to set boundaries, emotional boundaries. If the stakes are high, the emotional stakes are high for the interpreter, one of the strategies that the interpreter will use is to start interpreting in third person to detach themselves from the situation, so that they distinguish that they are the interpreter and not the victim. Important, important, important. Do not leave the client alone with the interpreter. If you need to leave the room, ask the interpreter to step out with you, because you don't know what's going to happen if the moment that you leave the interpreter and the client may start sharing information with the interpreter, and that opens a whole room, a whole gate of ethical dilemmas for the interpreter on what to do with this information. And there are forms that are, of course, that are going to be filled out, and many times we hear interpreters that they're being asked to fill out the form. That is inappropriate. An interpreter should not fill out the form. The service provider should. The interpreter will interpret the questions and the answers as well, and then the provider will transfer those on the form. And please do not ask interpreters to sign as a witness, because the interpreter is the interpreter. It can't be the interpreter and the witness on consent forms. So that's very important for you to keep in mind. Next slide, please. After the assignment, it's very important to allow time to debrief for both you and the interpreter. You want to check in, about the session. What went wrong? What went well? What could have gone better? What could you or the interpreter have done that may have been more conducive to a better session with your client? Was there something that you learned along the way that you want to discuss with the interpreter? Next slide, please.
And Rosanna, we need to wrap because we're a little bit
Wrap it
over
up.
time.
All right. So just 2 more slides, please. Now, it's not, again, we don't always get lucky to work with highly trained interpreters and qualified. So just be aware that an interpreter, and actually the slide up, please, before this one. If an interpreter engages, they should never engage with the client or yourself without alerting the other party. They should never put their opinion or speak over your voice. Go ahead and slide the next slide. And likewise, please do not expect interpreters to clarify concept for you, repeat questions automatically, edit what you say, or give an opinion. We can go down to the next to the last slide, all the way down. Yeah. I have created this flow chart to the one before, please, for all of you, that we will make available on as a separate handout that summarizes a lot of the stuff that I said. But again, I want you to leave you with this thought, to build resilient communities means really factoring the diverse needs of those communities into the available services and interventions. So for LEP and deaf victims of a crime, a solid language access plan is really fundamental to that path of resilience. So I hope that this sticks with you, if anything. And I want to thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to briefly talk about this. Thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers, Rebecca and Rosanna, for your time and attention. Thank you for Rebecca and Melissa, and Rebecca from the governor's office for hosting this. Again, you can contact us for technical assistance. There'll be a recording of this webinar we'll send out to you by email. It's also available at this link. Please fill out the survey and we have an evaluation survey. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear about what more you might want to learn on this topic, what other information you might want to have, and we'll be sure to add it to the webpage. And I want to thank you so much for joining us today and for all the work that you're doing with immigrant and LEP survivors. It's really your work that make all of these laws and language access a reality for these clients. So thank you again. Rebecca, any last words? Alan?
Nope, that's it. Thank you. And we'll get the recording and resources and PowerPoint out as soon as possible so you guys can have all this information.
Great. And Rebecca Grafton, you're muted.
Thank you all. Yeah, just wanted to reiterate, if you have questions, want to contact Ayuda, please email us at interpreterbank@ayuda.com. We also provide, technical assistance around language access and can do more trainings for you as well. So don't hesitate to contact us.
Great. Thank you all for joining.